15 years ago, June 17th, 2006, I was inside the New Yorker Hotel, literally right next door to the Manhattan Center, a block away from Madison Square Garden, at a show called In Your Face, which was hosted by an independent promotion called Ring of Honor. I had never been to an ROH show before. This was my first. The very first match of the very first ROH show that I ever attended had Jay and Mark Briscoe against Jason Blade and Sterling James Keenan, who I now listen to every Monday night on Raw next to Jimmy Smith and Byron Saxton. I look at the rest of that card, and I see a lot of familiar names, and a lot of names that many of you are very familiar with. Austin Aries, Nigel McGuinness, Colt Cabana, Davey Richards, Adam Pearce, who just fined Brock Lesnar $1 million on SmackDown Friday night, Claudio Castagnoli, Homicide, Chris Hero, Kenta, Samoa Joe, and Bryan Danielson, who went on to headline 2 WrestleManias and just had an excellent match on Friday night with another ROH alum in Eddie Kingston. I missed the Murphy Rec Center days. That was before my time. I missed the CM Punk era of ROH as it was happening, and the first summer of Punk when he signed his WWE contract on the ROH belt. You know, that Punk guy went on to do some things. So did Tyler Black. So did El Generico. And Kevin Steen. And Adam Cole. These men, and ladies too, like Allison Danger and Lacey and Daisy Hayes, were all part of the foundation of that promotion, and it helped put many of them on the map. I have a lot of fond memories of being at those shows, for Homicide's title win, for Danielson against Takeshi Morishima, Danielson against Kenta, for Bruno Sammartino's appearance, for some of those Steen and Generico battles, Joe against Kobashi. I wasn't there live for that one, but what a fucking battle that was. The ROH versus New Japan War of the World shows. I had more fun attending those Ring of Honor shows than almost any other show that I can think of. And I've been to a lot of shows over the years, going back to house shows in the 80s. And a ton of, Raw's Wars and pay-per-views and 8 WrestleManias. And a lot of them I had a great deal of fun. But being at those Ring of Honor shows, at the Manhattan Center when they were really just at their peak and firing on all cylinders, I can't think of any other show where I actually had more fun than I did attending those Ring of Honor shows. And I find it fascinating to trace the evolution of that company from that final show they did at the New Yorker Hotel to moving around the corner to the Manhattan Center, the Grand Ballroom, 8 floors up. What a big deal that was at the time. And then later moving downstairs into the bigger Hammerstein Ballroom. And then eventually the Holy Grail, Madison Square Garden, for the G1 Supercard. You can trace the evolution of Ring of Honor all within a 2-block radius in that little slice of Midtown Manhattan. The top story this week is the demise of Ring of Honor. The company is not officially dead. It still lives on in name, and they insist that they are going to be back. But Ring of Honor as we know it, Ring of Honor as it existed, is dead. What we know is that they will still be running their November television tapings and their Final Battle pay-per-view on December 11th, after which they will be going dark through at least April of next year. All talent signed to deals that are expiring at the end of this year will not have those deals renewed, but they will be paid through the end of December. That includes all of their champions. Everybody, regardless of their position on the card, no matter how big of a name you are, or you could be at the very bottom rung of the ladder, will no longer be under contract to Ring of Honor. If they have a deal that runs into next year, those people will remain under contract and be paid through March or April, at which point they too will no longer be under contract to Ring of Honor. Another sign that Ring of Honor as we know it is dead. When you basically release all of your talent, your entire talent roster, and allow them to go work elsewhere, you're basically back to operating as an independent promotion. Even though they're owned by a multi-billion-dollar media company who can afford to fund them and pay those contracts if they wish, Sinclair is choosing not to do so. Many talents have already posted on social media that they are available immediately for bookings. Joe Koff, the chief operating officer for Ring of Honor, did a 30-minute interview with Mike Johnson on PWInsider.com that I listened to the same day that he spoke to the roster and their employees on a Zoom call to give them the bad news. He went right from the Zoom call to talking to Mike Johnson. You could hear it in his voice, how emotional he was, almost defeated, but still trying his best not to be too bleak and to sound optimistic as much as he could about the future. He explained that they expanded, they signed new talent to big contracts, they tried to stay competitive, and they thought they could handle it, and then the pandemic hit, and they simply were not able to do it. And now they have to change their entire business plan. He said they're going to take the first quarter off and reimagine the product. There are few corporate buzzwords that make me roll my eyes more than when a company announces that they are reimagining something, or a movie studio is planning to reimagine an old movie just because they're too uncreative to just put their muscle behind new movie concepts. They have to go back and reimagine movies that were already made 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. He said the product is going to have a different look going forward. It will not look anything like WWE or AEW or even the way Ring of Honor looks today. He literally, at one point during this interview, referred to, and I don't even know if he realized it when he did it, but he referred to Ring of Honor as Ring of Honor 2.0. He said, that's what we're talking about here, ROH 2.0. Sinclair never poured the resources into Ring of Honor to get their production values up to the level of even an AEW, let alone a WWE. So the idea of an even more stripped-down version of their television show does not sound very appealing. Sean Ross Sapp reported that Koff told Talon he had multiple meetings trying his hardest to fight for ROH, but ultimately it was a Sinclair call. And I believe that, because this is not Joe Koff's decision to make here. This was completely a Sinclair Broadcast Group decision. One that I am sure he, like a lot of the talent and people who worked there, was shell-shocked by and not very happy about, and he probably did fight like hell to try to get them to change their mind, but it's not his call to make. If he is overruled by his overlords, then he has to abide by whatever it is that they want to do. This was absolutely a Sinclair call, not a Joe Koff call. So I can believe that. I can believe that he did in his mind what he felt he had to do to try to fight for Ring of Honor, and in the end, it simply was not enough. Now, Ring of Honor had issues even before the pandemic. Let's not put this all on the doorstep of COVID. It's very easy for people to just blame COVID for everything. Ring of Honor had problems long before there was a pandemic. But it was their handling of that pandemic, which I think deserves praise, that ultimately may have done them in. Unlike WWE and AEW, Ring of Honor went on a complete hiatus after COVID hit. They stopped running shows. They weren't airing any new content, in-ring content, on their weekly television show. They eventually started running shows again, but in empty buildings in front of no fans. They made no money from selling tickets or merch at arenas, all while paying talent, not just paying them on their contracts, but paying to also, quarantine them at hotels so they could work those empty arena shows, paying for testing. Whatever the bylaws were there in the state of Maryland, they did what they felt they had to do, including putting talent up for a week or two at a time at some of these hotels so that they could work these shows. Maryland, of course, is where Sinclair is based, out of Baltimore. But they were paying people the entire time. They did not, lay off a whole bunch of people. There were no mass layoffs. They took the health and safety of their wrestlers and their staff, by all accounts, very seriously, more so than any other promotion in this country. It's very much like what New Japan did, especially early on in the pandemic. There were New Japan executives. This is back when Harold Mage, I think, was still, in charge over there. But I remember reading that some of the executives took pay cuts so that they wouldn't have to cut anyone's pay on the roster and they wouldn't have to get rid of anybody. So a very similar situation here. I think New Japan and Ring of Honor both should be applauded for their handling of the pandemic, especially early on, in the way that they took it seriously, they tackled it. I don't think anybody can fault them for the steps that they took, especially early on, to make sure that they were, protecting their people as much as they could. But now we see the chickens have come home to roost. There are consequences. Even the best intentions can sometimes have consequences. Sinclair is a big corporate entity. Big corporate entities do not like losing money. And what happened this week was the consequence of that. For all of their billions of dollars, Sinclair got tired of losing money on their little wrestling promotion. It's not unlike WWE releasing all of that talent last year and this year, when they're making more money than they ever have before. Their bottom line looks as great as ever. And they let go of scores, dozens of people. Some have come back, some were furloughed, some were brought back, many were not. But to them, it doesn't matter. It's about the bottom line. It's about tidying up the books. Sinclair operates in much the same way. Now, I said that there were issues even before the pandemic. There was a reason that I said on this podcast years ago that Triple H and WWE were looking to weaken what, at the time, was a thriving independency, when he decided to turn the NXT brand into his own personal super indie. Which is basically what he did. He did that, though. He built that super indie under the WWE umbrella on the back of Ring of Honor, and a lot of talent from that promotion. He began raiding more and more talent from the ROH roster and making it very appealing for them to come over and sign with WWE. And give them the impression that, well, you come work for NXT. NXT is the hot thing, and then eventually you make your way up to Raw. You make your way up to SmackDown. You make even more money. You become a big star. It's no wonder. All those people took the money, they took all the hopes and everything that came with that, and they went for WWE. It was more appealing than sticking around with Ring of Honor because they saw a ceiling with Ring of Honor. Ring of Honor could only offer them so much. Ring of Honor was always that alternate that you could look to for great wrestling that you wouldn't always find on the WWE main roster. Eventually, that WWE main roster was, and still is in many ways, made up of talent that they took from Ring of Honor. And all of a sudden, Ring of Honor wasn't the belle of the ball anymore. They weren't the hot product anymore for hardcore wrestling fans the way they used to be. NXT was gaining steam with their takeover shows. Takeover being the key word. And I said at the time, if I'm Ring of Honor, if I'm Joe Koff, I'm watching my back and my front, because that was not going to end well for them. That was the first thing that really hurt them. They lost their cool factor. And then along came Tony Khan and AEW. And that only drove the dagger deeper into their chest. It was a slow death. It was not instant. They sort of bled out. It goes back to the All In pay-per-view in 2018 that Ring of Honor helped produce. In fact, they still own the footage of that event. Right? Some people are under the impression that AEW has that footage because there was a lot of AEW talent on that show. AEW does not own that footage because AEW didn't even officially exist at that point. Ring of Honor helped produce the event, which is still the biggest independent wrestling show ever produced. And, use that word independent kind of loosely, given the Ring of Honor backing. So, is it truly independent if you had backing from Ring of Honor? It was still, though, considered the biggest independent event ever produced. And it was a big success. Little did the folks at Ring of Honor know that they were engineering the start of their own demise. It was shortly after that show, despite their best efforts to keep them, and they tried, they presented a very lucrative offer to Matt and Nick Jackson to keep the Young Bucks. It didn't work. And the Bucks decided it was time to move on. And they, along with Kenny Omega and along with Hangman Page and others, Cody Rhodes, all left Ring of Honor at the same time to join this upstart AEW promotion, which did something that Ring of Honor never did. In all the years they existed, even Impact was able to get on a major cable television station years ago, and for a while they were pulling in. They were averaging over 1 million viewers a week. AEW did something Ring of Honor never could do. They got television on a major cable network on TNT, the home of WCW Monday Nitro. And it was the success of that all-in pay-per-view ultimately that convinced the brass and the suits at TNT, you know what? This could be a viable thing. Let's go ahead and take a chance on this. I mean, think about the absurdity of this. TNT is a major television network. They took a chance on a wrestling company that had no track record of television before. How does that happen? How often does something like that happen? Ring of Honor, much like Impact, had been around up to that point for almost 20 years. And they could never get a station like TNT to take a chance on them. They had syndicated television, but the syndicated television on certain networks throughout the country is different. It's not the same. You don't have the same level of, penetration and the same level of reach that you're going to get on a station like a USA Network or a TNT or a TBS or something like that. It kind of reminds me of the story of Spike TV going to Vince McMahon for his blessing back in 2005 to put this new reality show on after Monday Night Raw called The Ultimate Fighter. UFC may have been on its last legs at that point were it not for the success of that show and that show taking off in the way that it did, which led to big pay-per-view business for them. Because they were able to use that show as a vehicle to promote their fights on pay-per-view, which was and still is in many ways, although less so now because they have this guaranteed money. But back then, it was all about pay-per-view dollars. And The Ultimate Fighter is what really just kind of launched them into the stratosphere. That doesn't happen if Vince McMahon doesn't look at Spike TV and say, yeah, sure, go ahead. Go ahead, put that on after Raw. UFC may not have been around that much longer. Or Dana White certainly maybe wouldn't still be involved with them to this day. If maybe they got sold off to somebody else, because UFC business-wise was not doing very well at that point. Paul Heyman claimed to be in the room when Vince McMahon decided to let The Ultimate Fighter air after Raw because they had the right, I guess, to approve or reject any programming that came on after their show. And again, he said sure, and Heyman says he warned him not to do that because they should be very afraid of anyone who could take pay-per-view dollars away from them. But remember what WWE used to publicly argue. We're two completely different products. We don't look at them as competition. We're entertainment. They're in the fight business. It's two completely different things. Of course, we all know that's bullshit, and there was a lot of overlap between the two audiences. As different as they are, they're very similar. They attract very similar audiences. UFC went on to take a lot of pay-per-view dollars away from WWE. These decisions can come back to bite you on the ass. Now, even still, ROH was the de facto number 2 wrestling promotion in this country only a couple of years ago. This was before AEW ran that first Double or Nothing show in Las Vegas, and before Dynamite premiered on TNT later that year in October. Ring of Honor had the potential to be that number 2 and to stay that number 2 promotion. They sold out Madison Square Garden with a little bit of help from New Japan. I can tell you, as somebody who was at that show, there seemed to be more excitement for the New Japan side of things than the ROH side. And when the show was over, the prevailing thought was Ring of Honor really shit the bed with that show, and it was all about New Japan. But that was a huge milestone. No wrestling company other than one run by a McMahon had run the Garden since 1960. WWE tried to stop them. They tried to sabotage them and stop them from running Madison Square Garden. Sinclair lawyers had to step in, and they were able to stop their bullshit and get that reversed. Not only did they run the building, they sold it out. But they sold it out largely on the backs of Omega and the Bucks. When people initially bought those tickets, they thought that they were going to be on the show. They thought, hey, it's going to be the Elite, which was really, super over at that point among the hardcore fans. They were expecting the Elite crew were going to be there, but they weren't, because by the time the show actually came along, those guys were gone. They had decided to leave. They were no longer working for New Japan. They were no longer working for Ring of Honor. Now, would they have still sold out if people knew the Elite guys were not going to be there? Maybe. If only because it was WrestleMania weekend, and so I think with all those fans in town, and just, the whole attraction of it being the first time, a non-WWE wrestling show is at the Garden, I think they may have had a shot, but it would have been a lot more difficult for them to fill that building the way they did. After that, though, when that show was over, it was all downhill. Remember, they gave Marty Scurll the biggest contract in Ring of Honor history to not only wrestle for them, but also book for them. They gave him the book. He never even got through one chapter. I don't even think he got through one page of that book before he was gone. This was a once-in-a-lifetime offer. He took that over joining his friends in AEW, and everybody expected him to go along with the Bucks and Kenny and Paige and all of them. He should have been part of that crew. But he had this amazing offer where he could wrestle, he could book, he's making more money than he's ever made in his life. You can understand why he would take that offer over going somewhere else. And then, when the speaking out movement started, that spelled the end of Marty Scurll's tenure with Ring of Honor. He never even got to implement whatever his creative plans were going to be. They put all their eggs in his basket, and he never got to do anything for them. And he was gone. They had that investigation that went on forever, but, as long as that investigation was dragging on for you kind of knew how it was going to end, and it ended predictably, and he never worked for them again. Today, Ring of Honor has not been hot for a while. It has been ice cold. NXT recently rebranded, again, as developmental. But AEW is still the new kid on the block. GCW is gaining more ground with each passing month. You also have MLW, you have Impact, which is nowhere near its peak. But the wrestling landscape is very different than it was when Ring of Honor was at its peak. There's a lot more wrestling now than there was back then. If anything, the market is oversaturated with wrestling. There's almost too much wrestling. That makes it very difficult for Ring of Honor to stand out from the rest. They used to have something about them that made them stand out, that made them different, that made them appealing. But now here we are, 10 plus years later since they were off their peak. And what is it that Ring of Honor really brings to the table that you won't find in some or all of these other promotions? What is it about them that makes them unique and stand out? It's a lot harder to really identify what that is today, harder now than it would have been back then. The fact that they're not committing to April as an absolute return date does not inspire a lot of confidence. It sounds like a date based more on hopes and aspirations than anything concrete. But as of this moment, they do plan on coming back in some form. What form that takes is going to be up to Sinclair. Does Sinclair even want to keep Ring of Honor alive? They own 100% of the company, so it's their decision to make. If they want to keep it alive, they'll keep it alive. If they want it to die a quiet death, then it will die a quiet death. But ultimately, it is going to be their decision to make. And if the answer to that question is yes, what does that even look like? What does a reimagined Ring of Honor in 2022 and beyond even look like? Sinclair is already committed to airing that new WOW Women of Wrestling show on its stations next fall. Maybe they look at that and they figure, you know what, that's enough wrestling for us. We already have a new wrestling show that's going to be starting up in about a year, and we're going to be airing it. Maybe that's enough wrestling for us. The fall of ROH can be traced to a handful of decisions of their own making and a few that were out of their control, but it ultimately falls on how they reacted to those decisions. Had Sinclair really gone all in, no pun intended. I mean, technically they did go all in and they got fucked for it. But had they gone all in on Ring of Honor and poured more money into production and trying to retain at least some of the talent that left, we probably would not be talking about this right now. The top story this week would be something else. Sinclair saved Ring of Honor in 2011. Kerry Silkin, he couldn't afford to keep funding it on his own. And had Sinclair not made the offer they did at that time, the demise of Ring of Honor would have happened 10 years ago. But if you're looking to place blame on someone's doorstep, that doorstep is the corporate offices of Sinclair Broadcast Group in Baltimore. And to make matters worse, they announced that because of the cyber attack that hit Sinclair a few weeks ago, which they're still reeling from, that they would be airing an encore episode of Ring of Honor television this weekend on Jay Lethal in place of their weekly show, because Sinclair is still having what they call technical difficulties. That's how bad this ransomware attack was. They still can't air their own television show because of technical difficulties. It's been going on for like 2 weeks now. And I guess they have no access to whatever hard drive or footage that they shot the footage that was originally going to air this week, so they have to air a clip show. But I feel bad for the talent. You know, the Briscoes, they've been there forever. Jonathan Gresham, you hear a lot about him. Roosh, Bandito, Brody King, Dragon Lee, EC3. There is no shortage of great talent on the Ring of Honor roster. They will all find work somewhere. I don't know how many of them are going to go to AEW. I don't know how many of them might look to go overseas. I don't know how many of them are just going to work random independent dates. Maybe some of them will end up back in Ring of Honor. If they do reboot and they do come back, they might not be under contract, but maybe some of them do come back and work for Ring of Honor. I feel bad for them. I feel bad for the employees, like Ian Riccaboni, who's a really good announcer, and Brian Zane, who I consider a friend and who I know really enjoyed working there. Sports Illustrated had a report claiming that their sizable tape library is available to the highest bidder, and that they have been privately trying to move the library and shop it around for more than a year. But that they're asking for a much higher price tag than there is actual interest in the content. Brian Alvarez heard from multiple sources that dispute this and say the library is not for sale at this point. I think the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, where it's the WWE thing. Are you for sale or are you not for sale? What do you always hear Vince McMahon and Nick Khan saying? They're not out on the front lawn with a giant sign saying, "For sale, come talk to us," but the lines of communication are always open, and if somebody has an offer, we're more than willing to sit down and listen to what they have to say. And I think that's the same that applies here. I think if WWE or AEW or somebody came along with a humongous offer, and they wanted that Ring of Honor library, especially now, I mean, given everything that's happened over the last few days, and we see what the situation is, and obviously they're losing money, and Sinclair is looking to make changes. If somebody came along and was going to dump a whole bunch of money and back the Brinks truck up to get that tape library, I am sure that Ring of Honor and Sinclair and Joe Koff would be more than interested in hearing what they have to say. And if and when that tape library is for sale, Tony Khan should be all over that. If for no other reason but to get access to that all-in footage. But now they have people like Punk and Danielson on their roster. They can make money off all of that archival footage if they ever set up their own streaming platform or if they decide to sell DVDs. Tony Schiavone said he thinks AEW is going to have its own streaming service by the end of 2022. That would be a nice get for them. WWE, of course, they have their network on Peacock. Who knows what they would plan to do with it, but they also have a ton of former Ring of Honor talent under contract where that footage could be valuable. And they have licensed footage before from Ring of Honor for their DVDs and such. I think, in fact, when they did that big 3-disc set years ago on CM Punk, I think there was Ring of Honor footage in there. So they have licensed footage from them before. If they had full access to it, there's a lot that they could do with it. But to wrap this up, if you watched Monday Night Raw this week, you saw names like Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, Damian Priest. If you watched Dynamite or Rampage, you saw CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, the Young Bucks, Adam Cole, Bobby Fish. All are men who cut their teeth working for Ring of Honor. And whether you are a fan of it or not, the in-ring style that we see on television these days can largely be credited to ROH. You cannot minimize the influence that this independent promotion or once upon a time independent promotion has had on the overall wrestling landscape, not unlike the influence that ECW had on WWF and WCW back during the Monday Night War. And ECW ended up getting better television than Ring of Honor ever had. But here's this little renegade promotion and the influence that they had in terms of, the talent they use, in terms of, the hardcore style of matches and some of the international talent they brought in from Japan and Mexico and places like that. The impact is immeasurable that ECW had on WCW and WWF. There probably would be no Attitude Era were it not for ECW. Ring of Honor had a similar level of influence on modern day wrestling. And again, you may think that's a bad thing. Whether you think it's bad or good is irrelevant to the point that I'm making. The influence cannot be understated. And it is very sad to see at least this incarnation of Ring of Honor come to an end in this way. But the era of Honor will live on every week when you put on USA Network and you put on Fox and you put on TNT. Whether you realize it or not, you are seeing it. And I will always look back with a smile on those shows that I attended, even the ones with the doormen who used to laugh and call me Baby Dragon when they would rip my ticket. I took it as a compliment.